Well, welcome along to today's conversation, and it's my great pleasure that Lord Nicholas Stern is joining me today. You know, we're still facing a huge challenge around climate change against this backdrop of COVID-19 and the difficult global economic circumstances that we're now facing. I really think Nick needs no introduction, but Nick's seminal publication on the economics of climate change back in 2006 really changed the conversation. And this is a man that's been in that conversation ever since. His analysis, his thoughts, his insights are sought after everywhere around the world. And it's one of the great pleasures of my job and a great honor for the Institute that Nick is an advisor to us, and his insights, his support, his counsel is just invaluable. So Nick, welcome. Thank you for making the time. Tell us how you've been getting along in this isolation period.
Well, I'm sitting in West Sussex, where we live, in the middle of the South Downs National Park, and have been here since March the 12th, and shortly after we met in London, Brad. And I've been working away at an intensity that has been really quite extraordinary. Everything that we had before COVID continues. And on top of that, there's a tremendous amount of work associated with COVID. But I'm convinced that this is a moment when many people in the world are asking about fundamental change, are recognizing that the place that we've come from, say up to December last year, was fragile and dangerous, and in many ways inequitable. And we've seen one of the dangers manifested in terms of COVID. We realize that climate and biodiversity change make these pandemics more likely because they alter the behavior of domestic animals, wild animals, human animals, and the interactions between them. And that makes these pathogens, which are mostly zoonotic and have come from the animal world, they makes it more likely. So I think people have understood now, many, I hope most, that we have to build back better, that we have to do things differently, that where we've come from, dangerous, fragile, inequitable, and also that where we could go to, it could be enormously attractive. If that's right, then this could be a real moment where the world changes, and I hope it is.
Yeah. So Nick, you're right. We last met in London back in March. There was the beginnings of this pandemic, and very soon thereafter, of course, we saw the oil price collapse, the breakout of the supply wars, and demand collapsing around the world. I don't think any of us could have foreseen all of this coming along at this time. And of course, we're seeing these reports now that with the downturn in economic activity globally, so too have emissions fallen. And to your point, this is an interesting moment as inevitably governments sort of come out of this intensive care period that I think we've been in, trying to maintain jobs, trying to look after economies as best we can as everything's falling apart. But inevitably, we're going to go into rehabilitation shortly. And in my mind, that's going to be a series of large stimulus packages. I'm wondering what you're hoping to see in these packages around the world that actually set us on a different course, given that there's an awful lot of sunk cost infrastructure. People are keen to get back to what the jobs were that they had before. The dislocation risk is really big. So how do you see those policies ideally playing out?
I think in the rescue phase, rescue from the medical emergencies and stresses, and rescue from the economic ones associated with the inevitable shutdown, in that rescue time, protecting jobs is fundamental. And if we don't protect the jobs, if we spiral downwards into a prolonged period of unemployment in the world, and there is a real danger of that, if we do, then the social and political consequences could be extremely unpleasant. I mean, think of the 1930s. Yep. And the environmental ones would be too, because it would be a period of not much change. And we know that carrying on anything like as normal, even if it's 80% of normal is deeply dangerous. So as we do the rescue phase, we protect employment, which is the right thing. We have to think at the same time of how we move from rescue to recovery and how we move from recovery to transformation, growth. And at the moment, we're, depending where you are in the world, moving from rescue to recovery. Different parts of the world in different stages. Australia a bit ahead of the UK, China also moving fairly rapidly, but other countries are still have their own medical crisis growing rather than declining. So it depends where you are. But many parts of the world moving from rescue to recovery. And it's there that we have to be thinking of making this a sustainable recovery. So as we work with firms that have been given grants, or in many cases given loans for a limited period to take them through, we have to work, we as governments have to work as partners with firms, public and private sector, working together to set a new course. It's not sort of heavy-armed conditionality. It's saying we're trying to build back better. We're trying to recover in a way that's sustainable. So let's focus on jobs of the future. Let's not look back to the technologies of the 19th, 20th century. So I think and hope we'll see in those recovery packages a strong emphasis on sustainable issues that and technologies. That means two things, I think. One is investing and building and innovating for the medium term, and the other is what you can do immediately. What you can do immediately, actually, is quite remarkable. What Keynes would look for, and he'd be right, would be programs which are fast, labor intensive, and with strong multipliers. So if you think of retrofitting buildings, fast, labor intensive, strong multipliers. A lot of broadband, a lot of that's digging holes in the road, not all of it, not 5G, but there's still a lot of cable. So that is important. Rejigging our cities to make them much more friendly to cyclists and pedestrians. A lot of that actually is labor intensive, fast, and with multipliers. Of course, as you do those things, you're thinking of the medium term and building better as well. I would add to that list, and it's very important, natural capital, because restoring degraded land, planting trees, looking after water systems, again, those are things which are fast, labor intensive, and strong multipliers. So there's a lot you can do in the very short run. And I would highlight those two things, the kind of projects I've just described and the kind of partnerships with firms to look forward. And they will go alongside the innovations and medium-term investments that we need to make. And carbon capture, utilization, and storage is one of those things. And it's remarkable how the discussion in the UK is putting those three things together. The immediate, the partnership or conditionality on the unwinding or taking forward loans or converting loans to equity, and the innovations and investments in infrastructure that we need to make. So that, I think, is very interesting discussions that are taking place. Are they being embodied enough in these recovery packages? It depends where you look. I think there's a good emphasis in Europe, less so in the United States, and I think in the UK we're still in the process of building those. But I'm hopeful in the UK.
That's great, thanks, Nick. And it really does pivot fairly nicely to another area that I've found quite fascinating over the past nearly 4 months that I've been working from home. And you would expect, based on the experience, well, back in 2008-9, when I had the privilege of studying at Cambridge, and the text for that was your seminal work of 2006. And of course, we had the GFC then, the global financial crisis. And the aftermath from that was a whole series of stimulatory packages, including a lot in clean energy and for CCUS. And interestingly, at that time, what we found after a period of years was that the investment in CCUS actually tailed away, and the stimulatory packages actually didn't amount to large-scale facilities coming on stream. Fortunately, at the moment, we've come out of the bottom. We've just finished our latest stock take, and we've added another 10 new projects in CCS around the world. So it maintains its upward trajectory. Just in the last 2 weeks, the latest 2 facilities came online in Canada, in the very first hub and cluster actually in the world, the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. And so that's been a positive, and we've seen throughout this last 4 months our membership keeps growing. Alongside that, we've got the oil and gas industry, and many of the CEOs saying, yeah, life's difficult, business is tough, the COVID crisis is a problem, but we remain on track and committed to addressing net zero emissions. And we've seen a number of announcements from BP, Shell, a whole series of companies actually around the world. Nick, this strikes me as a big difference to what we saw in 2008, 2009. Do you think there's a chance here that we might just actually see the private sector push ahead faster than government, which nobody would have actually actively countenanced a few months ago?
Yes, Brad, I think there is, but I would shape the story with one addition, is that the governments around the world, and more than 100 countries now, have declared for net zero by 2050. So what governments have done increasingly is to set at least a, excuse me, you can edit that out, that they have set long-term targets, which I think are encouraging the private sector. But the initiatives and the commitments in the private sector are quite remarkable, and in some ways ahead of government. I mean, if you look at Microsoft, who declared that they will not only get to net zero earlier than 2050, but also they will look at the past emissions and work on those. If you look at what BP and Shell have said about going to net zero by 2050, they've been quite explicit that they include in that the CO2 from the burning of their products. Yep. It's not simply that the CO2 they create as a firm, but obviously fundamentally it's what they sell and that gets burned. So they're including that in their story. If you look at financial companies at the United Nations Summit in September in New York, the big alliance money management side was very clear that they were going to go net zero in their portfolio by 2050. And with roadmaps, obviously 2050 is a long way away, but roadmaps are very important. And when a firm commits, a firm like BP or Shell or Microsoft commits to a target, they're committing something measurable. They're not saying, oh yes, we take environment seriously. I mean, those can be empty words. Just to say, people always say they look after their employees, but do they look after their employees? But this kind of thing is measurable. You know, if you're setting yourself a path down to net zero with milestones along the way, that's measurable. So I think these commitments are important, and I do think in many cases you're seeing the private sector go out ahead of government. But it depends on a shared understanding of where we need to go, and ideally it should have, more than ideally, practically, we should have the policies that are going to give the incentives to do that. So it's one thing for a government to give a sense of direction, increasingly they are, but it's another to give the incentives, the practical incentives to follow that sense of direction, and we need more of that.
Well, indeed, and I might just tell you it's been a little heartwarming here in Australia over the last month to 6 weeks that the government's released a technology investment roadmap for discussion. It's put CCS back on the agenda here, and the leader of the opposition today reached out across the table figuratively and said we need to do this together. We need to bury the climate wars, and we're prepared to back CCS as well. they're going to disagree on the detail, but the movement, I think, is positive. And
I think, Brad, if
sorry,
you
Nick.
look, yeah, if you look at that and go back to your question about what's different from the last financial crisis, 2008-10, of course, this one's much bigger and it's truly global in a way
Yep.
that the other was mostly something starting in rich countries in their financial sectors. But we've seen technology move very strongly. You know better than anybody how the cost of the carbon capture technologies have fallen in these last dozen or so years. Quite remarkable, along with the costs of many other technologies. So the path to doing things sustainably in a way that manages climate change is much clearer in terms of what we can do, and we're seeing more and more that these new technologies offer us a really strong dynamic growth story to go forward. That's much stronger than it was a dozen years or so ago. You've got the commitments of government that we've just been talking about to net zero, and that language of net zero was not there in 2008-10, the start of the last crisis. That's language which we're correctly using because the science tells us we should over the last 3 years or so. So that's moved on a great deal. So technology, understanding through net zero, government commitment, and I would add the young people of the world. Now, we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years enormously encouraging movements where the young people are standing up, and they're standing up on the right side of history. And I look back to, I'm a bit older than you, Brad, I look back to my student days in the 60s, and we were very active, and I hope on the right side of history. For us, it was apartheid and civil rights and the war in Vietnam. But there have been quieter periods for younger people. Now I think they're standing up and standing up strongly. And that, I think, is a very important change as well. And we see it, of course, in our universities, which I'm the good fortune to be part of. And we see it very strongly there. So those things are really quite major changes. Technology, science, government, young people, the understanding of firms, those things have really moved. So that's why I'm more optimistic this time around than last time. And you're right, because last time round, that was an opportunity missed.
Yeah, well, I hope we don't miss it this time, Nick. And of course, ordinarily about this time, we'd be starting to have a conversation together about what we were going to be doing at COP in another 4 or 5 months' time. And of course, sadly, this year we're not going to be doing that. And I'm personally quite disappointed about it. I was looking forward to some time in Glasgow and all that goes with it, even though it'd be very cold at that time. But there's been, as you say, this building momentum on this road to net zero emissions, and I agree completely. That is the conversation piece now. Are we at risk of losing a bit of that momentum with no COP for a period of 2 years? What can we do in the climate community to keep that focus, to keep the pressure, and to keep moving along, Nick? What can we do?
Well, we've been discussing part of that just now. I mean, the key thing is the green recovery, the sustainable recovery. And we can push very strongly for that as the prelude or the path towards the transformational growth that we've been talking about for a long time. And we have to keep reminding that transformational growth story is enormously attractive. Cities where you can move and breathe, and ecosystems which are robust and fruitful. Sounds like a good idea, even if you never heard of climate change. And so that understanding is deepening. And then we're seeing that on top of that argument, we now have that a strong recovery really comes in large measure from the sustainable agenda, the kinds of things, the retrofitting of the building, that's the energy part of the energy story, the communications infrastructure like the broadband, the rejigging of the transport story, the advancing of the electric vehicle charging stations. All these things you can do quickly, along with, of course, the natural capital and the land and the forests and the water. So I think that argument that we had earlier, which is correct, that this transformational growth story really is an exciting growth story. In front of it, we've got a very powerful sustainable recovery story. So I think the first answer to your question, have we lost momentum? Well, yes, in the sense that it's been postponed, but possibly not in the sense that our to-do list now, which we didn't have before because that was pre-COVID, our to-do list now is actually very strong in terms of what we can do on the sustainability front. It's also a story of increasingly of equitable societies. And of course, the more labour opportunities there are, the better the society. It's very interesting in the UK how carbon capture, utilisation and storage is seen as potentially a driving force for the economy of the northeast of the UK, which is actually quite fragile from the point of view of employment prospects. So people are seeing not only the drive to sustainability as being full of opportunity, but actually full of opportunity often in a geographical way, which matches some of the problems of the society. Now, that is the case in the UK, it does. Of course, different countries have different geographical patterns. But it's an example of how this whole challenge has focused people's minds on what kind of recovery, what kind of growth. And that's a sense in which, if we do it well, we can pick up momentum. Because next year, in November next year, 2021, we will have the Glasgow COP26. And I hope that what we're discussing now will have been demonstrated. So we'll move into the COP26 having seen the possibilities of the sustainable recovery with even more powerful arguments about sustainable growth and the transformation to that. I think you'll see the technology advances being more deeply understood. It's all moving so fast that by the time we get well into next year, we'll see, as it were, many aspects of technology moving very quickly, including carbon capture and storage, and including air capture as well, where the costs are changing very quickly. So I think the movement of costs in another year is a second reason why perhaps we can restore or even do better on the momentum front. Politically, of course, we always have to be careful, but the presidency of the G7 and of the G20 in 2020 was United States and Saudi Arabia. And I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say that the governments of those two countries have not been in the vanguard of sustainable transformation. I won't develop that further, but you can see what I mean. At the same time, you have to remember that all countries, including the United States and Saudi Arabia, have different parts to them. And much of the United States is moving very strongly. And we know that in Saudi, there is actually quite strong investment in renewables as well. But that being said, if we look forward to next year, there's the UK in the presidency of the G7 and Italy in the presidency of the G20. And I'm pretty confident that those two countries in their presidencies will be making climate absolutely top of the agenda in a way, and the sustainable recovery in a way I think it's fair to say wasn't true in those two presidencies this year. So there's that international organization part of the story as well. So I think the bottom line is that there's everything to play for, and that we can pick up that momentum in some ways. We already are picking up that momentum, but basically we have to recognize that this postponement was essentially a logistical one. We simply, in the difficulties of communication and travel and so on, in the COVID time, we simply couldn't really advance it at the pace we need. And I know one more thing, which is that in early November, there's an election in the United States.
I won't possibly speculate on those things with you, Nick.
Nothing to add, just an observation.
Wouldn't be right. One thing that I have found interesting, however, just going back to Saudi Arabia in particular, in fact, those two countries slight conundrums in a way, because I think everything you've said is quite reasonable and borne out by experience. And yet we're involved at the moment with Saudi Arabia on a circular carbon economy concept that they've got, which is actually really
Yeah.
fascinating and they are strongly committed to, driven completely, I think, from a sustainability perspective, undoubtedly around national wealth and how do you manage their very substantial carbon footprint into the future. But I've found that a really interesting piece of work that we've been involved with them on. And full marks to Saudi Arabia for moving down that pathway. I mentioned before we've just finished our latest stock take on CCS facilities around the world, and we've gone up by 10. And it's the United States where the vast majority of these are now, and whether by intention or accident. But the great good fortune is that this tradable tax credit, known as 45Q, along with the California low carbon fuel standard that's got permits trading up around 140 US dollars a tonne, are driving CCS projects. And it's been quite fascinating for me to see how you don't need crazy policies. These are not crazy policies. These are very targeted policies. And all of a sudden, the capital arrives. And so for CCS, at least, Nick, there's some bright spots in those two countries.
Absolutely right. And it always is a very powerful lesson there. Always look at what's in a country, what's really happening in terms of investment, business, change. And I completely agree in both the United States and in Saudi, that change is remarkable. And in many ways, they've been leaders. And if you look at the whole Gulf area, that part of the world where you find Saudi, the costs of solar, for example, have gone down quite remarkably. And you've got deep discussion of how we move over time to, as it were, exploiting our wealth from sun and wind and sea away from the fossil fuels. But there's a very important transition to make. And of course, carbon capture and storage has a very powerful role to play in that transition. So I think you're seeing, as it were, people recognizing that this is a change that's have to move very powerfully over the next 20 or 30 years. We are going to be using fossil fuels to a considerable extent in that time. So the challenge is to use them in a wise and clean way, as of course the economy changes very strongly over this next 20 or 30 years. And I think people are seeing this now in a rather sort of careful, strategic change management perspective, in a way that people were sort of in dogfights of this versus that in the past, saying, well, we know where we're going, but we know it's going to take us a while to get there. Let's manage it. Let's manage it well. And we know we're going to need to use carbon capture in that process.
Yeah, and Nick, just sort of following on a bit in a way from that United States example, you and I over the years have had many discussions about valuing carbon, carbon pricing, carbon trading, all these things. Heck, we know countries, don't we, Nick, that governments have won and lost elections on the back of this topic. And in this COVID time, working from home, I think I've done more webinars and I've done a conference this week online, which I found very odd. But the recurring question that I get is always, what's the carbon price that's needed for CCS to be deployed? As if that's the only thing. Now, you've done a huge amount of work on carbon pricing over the years, and I know from an economist's perspective, there's an efficiency question that comes with this. But I think what disturbs me a little bit, Nick, is that I tend to be hearing this from people, particularly in the financial community, interestingly, as if all I need to do is put a carbon price in place and everything will just follow. I'm interested in a couple of things, if I can. But first of all, from your perspective, does it really matter whether it's a tax, whether it's traded, whether it's a tradable tax credit? I mean, there's a whole stack of different ways you could just regulate, and there's effectively a shadow price on the carbon. Does it matter? And do we actually need to be a bit more sophisticated in the way we're discussing this whole valuing carbon and bringing technologies into the market?
there are two crucial points here. One is, could this change, this rapid change that we need so badly, could that be driven only with a carbon price? Do we need other things? And I think the answer to that question is we really do need those other things, but we also need the carbon price. So not by carbon price alone, but please, it's going to be much easier and more efficient if we do have a carbon price. So that's the first part. The second part is what kind of carbon price? How do you put it in place? But let me take the first one first. There are a lot of problems in markets here beyond the fundamental one. That is fundamental, that if you do something that damages others and you do it for free, like pumping carbon into the atmosphere, then you'll do far too much of that you will not take into account sufficiently well the damage you are inflicting on others. You know, when we use somebody else's labor, we expect to pay for it. If you go to a restaurant, you expect not only to pay for the labor, but also the food and the place and the site. And so you expect to pay for that because you're depriving other people of those things. You're using it for yourself. If you use the space in the atmosphere for yourself, you are actually putting burdens on other people, and you should pay for that too. So that's a fundamental market failure unless there's policy there. But there are others. You know, research and development give knowledge to others, and there's a great urgency on this. There are important networks, grid networks, recycling, reusing, carbon capture, utilization, storage is going to have that network, so it's going to function well. Those are all places where without action, markets are not going to work anywhere near well enough. Capital markets too. We know, surely we've learned that capital markets, whilst they do try to manage risks, there are some limitations on how well they do that. And of course, you've got the whole story of air pollution and so on, and issues around information. So the idea that there's only one market failure there, just fix it and it's all sorted, I think is a mistake. At the same time, it's a mistake to de-emphasize carbon prices, because we really do need them for that fundamental story of the market failure and the externality that I began with. So that's the first part of the story. And R&D, of course, high up that list, capital markets, high up that list, so too the networks, and of course the air pollution. So those are big things, they're not small things that have to go along with the carbon price. And of course you need city design. You know, you can't just flick on a carbon price and expect cities to be redesigned. There's and so much depends on that. You know, 70-some% of the world's emissions come from cities. How they function is fundamental. Similarly, land use systems. You know, we pay about $700 billion a year in agricultural support. Now, agricultural support actually, for various reasons, probably quite a good idea. And I'm not asking to change the level of support, but how we do it is often not particularly helpful. You know, it leads to degraded land, poisoned waters, cutting down forests. So those systems stories are very important as well as the market failure stories. So not only by carbon price, but please keep that carbon price strong. And Joe Stiglitz and I did a paper for the Carbon Price Leadership Coalition a few years ago now, 3 years ago, where we argued that it really should be $50 to $100 a ton, the price of carbon dioxide by 2030, and at least 40 now and rising strongly. So that's where we argued we would need to be to have, along with the other policies, a decent chance of getting to net zero by 2050. The second part of the story is how do you do it? Well, I'm relaxed as to, as long as there's a good, strong carbon price, you know, at least 40, arguably higher now, moving closer to 100 by 2030, that will be what is of fundamental importance. The mechanism, well, it'll be different in different countries. Personally, I like the simplicity of the carbon tax. You can see what it is, and but Sometimes politically, it's easier to do it through the tax credit, as we saw in the United States,
Yep.
where that went through rather cheerfully, and whereas, of course, a carbon tax would be extremely controversial. So it's horses for courses, simplicity, carbon tax, politics, not always easily done that way. But if you do have a carbon tax or a strong carbon price, it's very important to use some of that revenue to support poorer people and to support as consumers and to support a decent, civilized, just transition on the production side as you move away from the fossil fuels. So I would argue, yes, strong carbon price, I've tried to indicate where it should be, but also some of that revenue should be used for distribution, equity purposes, both on the consumption side and on the production work side.
Thanks, Nick. And I find it interesting now that we're getting more and more, particularly industry leaders, starting to talk about carbon prices in those sorts of ranges. I hope I quote him correctly, but I believe Bernard Looney at BP just in the last week has talked about $100 by 2030. Those sorts of numbers are transformational in the deployment of CCS alone, particularly in these well-known, technologically proven areas like gas processing, for example, where for under $25 a ton, we can probably remove about 250 megatons a year just on CCS. Some of the numbers are incredibly small that you need to provide that incentive to actually do it. And it seems to me that for governments, there's a big opportunity with revenue here that you can then use to actually have a just transition into this whole new growth story that we so desperately need.
Absolutely, and I've interacted with Bernard Looney on that, and he's very committed to that story. The IMF are talking about at least $75 a ton for a carbon price. I think finally people are talking about carbon prices in the right ranges, but we're also observing that carbon prices are not yet, with one or two small exceptions, in that range. But I think the momentum's building. But the politics of it, of course, are fundamental importance. And those two uses of revenue I really should underline: protecting poorer consumers and managing a transition well. And increasingly, I think that's accepted as part of the story. And of course, if you remove the terrible inefficiency and damage, you're actually increasing your output and your resources over time. That's what removing market failures does for you. So we should recognize that there are real gains coming from this story, including in kinds of investments and technologies we will be following.
Nick, thank you so much. We've spent quite an amount of your time and catching up on a very wide-ranging conversation. At the end of this, I feel re-engaged and positive again. I think we've seen some good initiatives coming out, particularly from the EU, with a number of announcements over the last little while. I'm looking forward and hoping that more countries keep going down that path, and I'm massively heartened by the increasing number of CCS projects, the commitment that's coming from particularly the oil and gas industry here at the moment. And I'm sorry I won't be seeing you this year in Glasgow, but here's to the following year. So Nick, I hope you stay safe. Enjoy undoubtedly the beautiful English countryside. And once again, thank you so much for your time today.
It's a real pleasure to talk to you, Brad, and please keep going in the tremendous work that you and your institute are doing.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nick.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.